Hey everyone, welcome to Creepy X Horror. We have some self-driving, uber scary stories for you tonight. Do me a favor, if you like the stories you hear, hit that subscribe button for me. Now, let's get on with the scary stories. The Phantom Ride, written and read by Ren Bryant. Ella Matthews gripped the steering wheel tightly as she pulled into the driveway of her new home in Oak Ridge, Illinois. The shadows cast by the towering trees seemed to swallow the small town whole, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, ready to take hold of her. The weight of her past lay heavy on her chest, making it difficult to breathe. After the tragic death of her fiancé, Ella sought refuge in Oak Ridge, hoping the quiet town would provide solace she desperately needed, far away from the madness of Chicago. She was a tech journalist by trade, her career taking her all over the world. But now, the thought of being in a bustling city made her shudder. It was time for a change, something simpler, where she could heal the wounds and put her life back together. Upon her arrival, Ella was greeted by her new neighbor, Miss Beckett. A woman of advanced age, her hunched back and gnarled hands spoke to a lifetime of hard work. The wrinkles around her eyes deepened as she smiled, offering a plate of homemade cookies as a welcoming gift. "Welcome to Oak Ridge, dear," she said warmly. "I'm Martha Beckett, but you can call me Marty. If you need anything at all, don't hesitate to ask." "Thank you, Marty," Ella replied with a forced smile, trying to push away the shadows of sorrow that threatened to swallow her. "I'm Ella Matthews." The two women chatted idly for a few minutes, exchanging pleasantries and discussing the charming nature of the town. As their conversation drew to a close, Ella couldn't help but notice the way Marty's eyes darted around nervously, as if searching for something that wasn't there. "Is everything all right?" Ella asked. Marty hesitated, her gaze darting around once more before finally settling on Ella. "There's been some strange occurrences in this town lately," she said reluctantly. "But you shouldn't worry yourself, dear. I'm sure it's nothing." Ella's curiosity was piqued, but she decided not to press the matter further. After all, she had come to Oak Ridge to escape her troubles, not delve deeper into them. She thanked Marty once more for the cookies and bid her good night. In the days that followed, Ella focused on settling into her new life. She explored the town, familiarizing herself with its quaint shops and picturesque streets. As she walked through the town square, she couldn't help but notice the way people huddled together, whispering in hushed tones as they cast furtive glances around. It was as if the entire town was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As she sat in the local diner, sipping her coffee and trying to focus on the latest assignment her editor gave her, Ella couldn't help but overhear the conversations around her. In the booth next to her, barely audible above the clink of silverware and the hum of the coffee machine, people said words like autonomous Uber car and haunted. Ella didn't think much about it, except for when she looked around and saw what looked like fear painted on faces. Unable to resist her investigative instincts, Ella approached a group of locals huddled in a corner booth. They were hunched over the table, sharing their stories. They eyed her wearily as she sat down, but she offered a friendly smile, hoping to put them at ease. "Hi, I'm Ella," she said, extending her hand. "I'm new in town and I couldn't help but overhear your conversation. Do you mind if I join you?" The man closest to her, a burly man with a thick beard and a worn flannel shirt, hesitated before shaking her hand. "I'm Paul," he said gruffly. "This here's Sarah, and that's Tom." He gestured to the others, a young woman with fiery red hair and a middle-aged man with a kind face. "Nice to meet you," Ella said, her voice steady, despite her racing heart. "So, What's this about an autonomous Uber car? It sounds interesting." The three exchanged glances, as if weighing whether to share their stories with the stranger. Sarah finally leaned in, her green eyes filled with fear. "There's been incidents," she whispered, looking around to make sure others couldn't hear. "People getting into this self-driving Uber and then, well, they're never seen from again." Ella's eyes widened, her journalist mind kicking into high gear. "You mean people are disappearing?" Tom nodded, his hands trembling slightly as he clutched his coffee cup. It's like the car's alive, like it has a mind of its own. It picks people up and they just vanish." Ella felt herself tense up as the group recounted stories of those who had fallen victim to the mysterious car. She knew that this story was too good not to look into. Ella began to dig deeper, spending her days poring over old newspaper articles and taxi applications in City Hall. Her search led her to the town bookstore, a small shop that would have been gobbled up by Barnes & Noble if it were in Chicago. There, she met Oliver, the shop's owner, a thin, bespectacled man with a wealth of knowledge about Oak Ridge's history. He seemed to know every forgotten tale the town had to offer. As Ella shared her findings with him, Oliver's eyes lit up with recognition. "You're not the first to look into this, you know," he told her. "There was a man a few years ago, Jack. He was obsessed with the same story. He was a local mechanic, but he had a tragic past of his own. Lost his wife in a car accident, you see." Ella thought of her dead fiancé and her heart ached for Jack. Though she knew it wouldn't be comfortable, she decided to track Jack down, hoping that together they could piece together the truth about this autonomous Uber car. Her search led her to Jack's garage, a dimly lit, clustered space that smelled of oil and rust. As she approached, she could hear the sound of metal clinking against metal. Jack stood hunched over the hood of a car, his hands stained with grease as he wrenched. "Jack?" she called out hesitantly, unsure of how he would react to her sudden appearance. "I'm Ella Matthews, a journalist. I've been looking into the strange happenings with this self-driving Uber car. Oliver told me you might be able to help." Jack looked up, his face streaked with dirt and sweat, his eyes filled with a glassy look of loss and pain. "I thought I had buried that story a long time ago," he said, wiping his hands on a ratty shop towel. "But if you're determined to uncover the truth, I suppose there's no stopping you. Just know that some things are better left buried." It was a weird warning, something Ella wasn't expecting. Oliver didn't say anything about him burying the story. If there was something wrong with the Uber system, it should be exposed, not buried. Yet despite the warning, Jack was the only person Ella had to rely on in her quest for the truth. "You mind telling me what you found out?" Ella said. Jack described the car like you would expect a mechanic to. It was a black, late-model Chevy Caprice. The engine purred, the exhaust rumbled. He said everything about the car was dark, including the tinted windows and the black rims. But then he said something curious. "It moved like a ghost, silent and stealthy," Jack said, with a low growl that followed in its wake. Jack shared the story with Ella of Alexander Blackwood, a brilliant engineer who had once called the town home. Alexander was a reclusive man, focused solely on his work, creating cutting-edge technology that had the potential to change the world. However, his life took a tragic turn when he was falsely accused of a heinous crime, one he swore he did not commit. Shunned by the town and left destitute, Alexander retreated to his secluded home, consumed by rage and a desire for vengeance. It was in those dark days that he poured his tormented soul into his greatest creation, an autonomous car that would serve as an instrument of his revenge. The Phantom Ride, Jack called it. He said Uber paid him a buttload for the tech and said they would put his self-driving car on the streets of Oak Ridge. As Ella listened to the story, she couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for the man who had been wronged by those he had trusted. One time, Ella was nearly fired when her source recanted. It was an exclusive about sexual harassment in big tech. Once it went to print, her source said it was all lies. Ella had powerful CEOs calling her editor, demanding her head, so she could understand how Alexander would want revenge. And as if the story wasn't weird enough, Jack next said something that gave Ella chills. Alexander's dead now, but I think he somehow managed to imbue his tech with his spirit, Jack said. Now, the car's cursed to roam the streets of Oak Ridge, seeking retribution against the descendants of those who had wronged him. When I looked into it, it became clear the Phantom Ride did not choose its victims at random. Rather, it seemed to target specific individuals, those who had a connection to Alexander's tragic past. Working together, Ella and Jack tried to piece together clues. Meanwhile, the people of Oak Ridge grew more and more fearful. The car was no longer a car. It was a feral thing, a great snarling beast with headlights aglow, its engine roaring, seeking out its prey with a terrible hunger. And though people talked about the car, no one ever saw it. Yet the streets, once filled with laughter and camaraderie, now lay silent and deserted, as if the very soul of the town had been drained away. Neighbors whispered that the car didn't just pick people up, but hunted them down. Mothers held their children tight and wouldn't allow them to play in the street or even go outside. Everyone worried they could be next. Ella could feel the weight of the town's fear pressing down on her, a heavy burden that threatened to crush her spirit. But she refused to give in to despair, determined to see her story through to the end. As she and Jack continued their research, interviewing people who had seen the car, they began to notice a pattern in the car's movements. It seemed to appear only at night and always in the same area, as if drawn to a specific location. They decided to stake out the area, hoping that by observing the car, they might be able to find a way to shut it down. It was a cold September night in Oak Ridge, the sky moonless and inky, pierced only by the faint glow of their flashlights. As they waited, hidden among the shrubbery off 39th Avenue and McKinsey, they could feel the oppressive presence of the Phantom Ride, like an unseen force lurking just out of sight. And as the hours crawled by, the air between them was thick with unspoken words. And then suddenly, it appeared, the black Chevy Caprice, its headlights like two malevolent eyes cutting through the darkness. Ella's heart raced as she watched the car approach, her every instinct screaming at her to run, to escape the nightmare that was unfolding before her eyes. But she knew that to flee would be to abandon the people of Oak Ridge to their fate. So she steeled herself, determined to face this schizo tech head on. And as the car drew nearer, its headlights cast eerie shadows across the deserted street. The car pulled to a stop, its engine humming menacingly as it idled, waiting for its next victim. Ella and Jack exchanged a determined glance, and with a deep breath, they stepped out of the shadows and approached the car. As they neared the vehicle, they could feel an evil energy that seemed to emanate from it. It was as if the blackness of the Chevy was alive and would spill out onto the world when the door opened. And then it did. The back door opened by itself, inviting Ella and Jack into its black abyss. The engine roared to life, cracking as it revved. Smoke pumped out of the exhaust, sending up noxious fumes that made Ella and Jack's head spin. The car wasn't giving them a choice. Get in or suffocate, it seemed to be saying. Ella hesitated, wondering if this was the right move, but she remembered why she was doing this, why she had come to Oak Ridge in the first place. Clenching her jaw, she took a deep breath and climbed in after Jack. The inside of the car was pitch black. Ella couldn't see anything beyond her hand, nothing but the bright green glow from the car's dashboard, illuminating an empty driver's seat. The car took off with the screech, sending both Ella and Jack back into their seats. As the loose stones and sand flew up around the outside of the car, they tore through the streets, hurtling forward, past streetlights and buildings that flew by in a blur. Ella felt sick to her stomach, lurching with every bump and turn. Jack had his eyes peeled for any sign that there was something in the car that shouldn't be there. There had to be something in this car, he thought, some sort of kill switch. The car sped up more, the speedometer showing double the speed limit. Ella heard Jack muttering to himself and realized that he was counting the turns, trying to get his bearings. They had been driving for a while now, and there was no signs of the car slowing down. Suddenly, the air around them grew colder, and a faint odor of decay filled the car. Ella's skin prickled with fear, and she knew that they had entered a different world. But it wasn't until they saw him that their worst fears were confirmed. Alexander was sitting in the passenger seat, his eyes glowing with the sickly green light that matched the dashboard. His skin was rotted, and he was wearing a black suit that clung to him. His gangly hands gripped the armrest tightly. When he saw Ella and Jack in the back seat, he grinned, revealing a mouth of sharp teeth. Ella screamed, and Jack reached for his pocket, drawing out a small silver pocket knife. Alexander chuckled at the sight and said, "Don't bother, I'm not after you." He turned to stare out the windshield, and Ella followed his gaze. They were in the heart of the forest now, and surrounded by ancient trees and a thick fog. She could make out a small cabin in the distance, its windows glowing with an orange light. Alexander leaned into the back seat, close to Ella, his breath hot against her ear. "I brought you here because I need your help," he whispered. "I want to tell my side of the story, to clear my name, and I want you to write it." Ella recoiled, trying to push him away, but Alexander gripped her arm. His touch was like searing pain. "You can't refuse me," he said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. Ella felt nauseous. She knew that this ghost, or whatever Alexander was, couldn't be trusted, and that his intentions were far from pure. But she also knew that if they were going to get out of this alive, she would have to play along. "What do you want me to write?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Alexander grinned, his eyes glinting in the green light of the dashboard. "The truth about what really happened that night, and how I was framed for a crime I didn't commit. I did nothing to those women. They're all lies. And when the world knows the truth, then I will set you free." Ella studied him, trying to gauge his sincerity, but it was like trying to read the mind of a madman. She knew that what he was asking for was impossible, that the truth about what happened to Alexander would never be known. But she also knew she had no choice but to play along, at least for now. "Oh, okay," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll write your story, but first you need to let us go. In order to tell the world about you, we need to get out of here." Alexander's grip on her arm tightened. "Not yet," he said. "First, you need to hear my story." Jack tried to intervene and push Alexander away from Ella, but his hands moved right through him. Alexander let out a mocking laugh. "You put up a fight, just like your wife did," Alexander said with a wicked smile that showed off his razor-sharp teeth. "My wife died in a car accident, you asshole," Jack said. "Did she now?" Alexander said, and turned around to look out the front windshield. Jack fumed, punching his fist into the palm of his hand. Ella reached out for his leg and gave him a gentle pat to let him know he wasn't alone. As the phantom ride rolled closer to the cabin, apparitions materialized from the wooden siding, ethereal figures that glowed with an unholy light. "Oh my God," Jack muttered under his breath as he gazed out the window. "Those are the poor souls you killed." Alexander spun around in his seat, his emerald eyes blazing with a fiery intensity. "Not killed, saved! That is the story that must be told." His words echoed like thunder in the car. In the darkness of the back seat, Ella caught Jack's eyes. She flicked her chin to the center console. Jack squinted and shrugged. But then he saw it, a small compartment, the thing that didn't belong. Ella quickly created a distraction. So your story, why don't I write it down? I just need pen and paper." She leaned forward, hunching over the center console, as Jack went underneath her and fiddled with the compartment. Alexander reacted with fury and threw Ella back into her seat. The back of her head bounced off the headrest and made her see stars. Jack leaned back in his seat. He was smiling. In his hand were 2 wires, one red, one yellow. Alexander looked at the wires, his eyes burning with fury as he slowly dematerialized. Suddenly the phantom ride lurched. Ella braced herself as the car spun out of control, heading straight for the cabin. She could hear Alexander's laughter coming from everywhere, as if he was the car itself, a twisted and maniacal sound that made her blood turn to ice. And just as they were about to crash, the car jolted to a stop. Jack had successfully disconnected the car's autopilot, causing it to stall. They were safe, for now. As Ella and Jack looked at each other in disbelief, they noticed the ghostly figures outside began to get closer, their half-formed faces twisted in agony. The ghosts began to pull at the doors, trying to get inside the car. Ella held her breath, hoping they would give up, but they didn't. They kept pulling and tugging, their nails scraping on the metal. "What do we do?" she screamed to Jack, feeling the cold sweat on her skin. "We run," he said, opening the door without thought and leaping through the ghost. Ella followed suit, running as fast as she could through the dense forest. As they ran, they could hear the sounds of the phantom ride revving up again, Alexander's laughter echoing through the trees. But they didn't look back. They just kept running, their hearts pounding in their chests. Finally, they emerged from the forest, panting and gasping for air. In the distance, they could see the lights of Oak Ridge, a beacon of safety. As they made their way to the town, they kept a lookout behind them in case Alexander and his car followed. But it didn't. It was as if as soon as they had left the forest, the ghostly figures and Alexander had disappeared, like they never existed in the first place. When they finally reached the safety of Jack's garage, Ella collapsed onto a chair, exhaustion overtaking her. Jack kneeled beside her, his hands on her back, comforting her. They both knew they had narrowly escaped a terrible fate. "I hope we never see that car again," Jack said after a moment. "You okay?" Ella nodded, still catching her breath. "I will be," she said, looking up at him. "Thank you. You saved us." Jack smiled, his brown eyes warm and reassuring. "No, we did it together," he said, standing up. "But let's not do it again, okay?" Ella laughed, feeling a bit of tension ease from her shoulders. "Agreed," she said, standing up and stretching her legs. "I came here to slow down, to get away. I think I need a stiff drink." Jack grinned. "Hope whiskey's okay with you," he said as he walked to the garage kitchen. "By the way, Welcome to the neighborhood. The Silent Rides of Phoenix. Written and read by Ren Bryant. The night was choked with the dust that the desert had so generously donated to the city. Michael's throat was parched, and his lips cracked like old sun-bleached paint on the side of an abandoned building. He sat on the cold pavement, back against a graffiti-covered wall. The darkness of the alley provided a temporary reprieve from the world's judgments, but the cold cement always reminded him of how far his fall from grace had been. A faint glow flickered in the distance, as if the city itself was trying to hold on to its last bits of life. The neon lights blinked on like an erratic heartbeat, and the urban pulse throbbed around Michael, filling his ears with the constant drone. "You got a smoke, man?" Michael's voice rasped as he turned to the man next to him, a fellow homeless denizen of the Phoenix streets. His companion's face was etched with lines like an old road map, whose creases had been worn thin by time and sun. "Yeah, sure, man," the man replied, digging into the pocket of his ragged, grease-stained jacket. He produced a crushed pack of USA Gold cigarettes, and together they shared the last one, lighting it with a cheap plastic lighter stained by human fluid. They puffed away, the smoke mingling with the desert dust and the smell of stale urine that permeated the alley. It was a blend of scents that Michael had come to know well, a symphony of human decay punctuated by the distant sirens and angry voices of the city beyond. "Name's Tommy," the man said after a moment, extending a grubby hand. Michael shook it, feeling the rough, callous skin that spoke of years spent working with his hands. "Michael," he replied, his voice barely audible over the sounds of a passing car. For a while, they sat in silence, the world beyond the alley continuing its relentless march forward, while they remained trapped in a stagnant pool of despair. The glowing ember of the cigarette burned down, the flame chasing the darkness away for one brief, fleeting moment before being extinguished by the flick of Tommy's finger. "What brings you out here, Michael?" Tommy asked, breaking the silence. He seemed genuinely curious, which was a rarity in the world of the homeless, where most people only cared about their next meal or where they lay their head. Michael hesitated, the shame of his past still burning in his chest. But the weight of the truth was heavy, and Tommy's kind, if not battered face offered a rare opportunity for release. "I used to be a software engineer," Michael began, the words tumbling out like marbles from a jar. "I had a good job, a nice house, a wife, a kid, but I lost it all, made some bad choices, and everything just fell apart." Tommy nodded, a look of understanding in his eyes. He heard stories like Michael's 100 times before, and they all followed a similar trajectory. A good life, lost to the cruel whims of fate and the crushing weight of bad decisions. As they talked, a low hum began to grow in intensity, like the distant approach of a swarm of bees. At first, it was barely noticeable, easily drowned out by the city noise. But as it grew louder, it became impossible to ignore. The hum was accompanied by a series of soft whirling sounds, as if a tiny thousand gears were all turning in unison, working together to create a single harmonious hum. Michael glanced up, trying to locate the source of the sound. It seemed to be coming from the street, so he stood up and edged closer, curious and strangely drawn to the mysterious noise. As he peered around the corner, he spotted the source, a sleek black self-driving electric Uber gliding silently down the street. The car seemed to float on a cushion of air, its wheels making no contact with the ground. Its headlights glared like the eyes of some malignant creature, cutting through the thick haze of dust and grime that hung in the air. Tommy joined him, curiosity piqued by Michael's sudden interest in the car. "What's up with that thing?" Tommy asked, his voice low, almost reverent. I've never seen one up close before, Michael replied, his eyes glued to the vehicle as it passed. He thought something was unnatural about it, almost sinister. Tommy scoffed. Just a fancy car for rich folks, that's all. They're everywhere these days, huh? But Michael wasn't so sure. As the car continued down the street, he noticed that it seemed to be following a strange, meandering path. It slowed down and sped up at odd intervals, and its route appeared to have no clear destination. He thought these AI-driven cars were supposed to be better than humans. They watched as the car approached an old, disheveled man shuffling along the sidewalk. The man was hunched over, his possessions clutched to his chest in a dirty, tattered bag. He was another of the city's lost souls, just like Michael and Tommy. But something about him seemed to catch the car's attention. Before either of them could react, the self-driving Uber swerved sharply towards the man. There was a sickening crunch, followed by a brief, pitiful cry as the car plowed into him. The man's body crumpled like a discarded piece of paper, and his bag of possessions scattered across the sidewalk. Michael's heart raced. Shock and horror went through his veins like heroin. He looked over at Tommy, who seemed to be just as stunned by what they witnessed. Did that just happen? Tommy stammered, his voice trembling. The car didn't stop. It didn't even slow down. Instead, it continued on its bizarre meandering path, as if nothing had happened. The man's broken body lay in a twisted heap on the sidewalk. A puddle of red formed under him. The alley was no longer a sanctuary. It was now a place of death, a place where the line between man and machine had been brutally blurred. Michael knew he couldn't just sit back and let this happen. He had to do something. As he raced towards the scene of the crime, his mind reeled with questions. Why would the car kill someone? Who would program a car to kill? And was this an isolated incident, or was there a pattern to this car's seemingly random movements? The one thing he knew for sure was that he had to find answers. He had to stop the self-driving Uber before it struck again. And as he stood over the broken body of the homeless man, Michael realized that with this sort of tech, the world had just become a far more dangerous place. Not only for the homeless, but for everyone. A few days had passed since the chilling incident, and Michael couldn't shake the image of the car striking down the homeless man. The street seemed to hold a new menace, and shadows were cast in a darker hue. Every passing vehicle felt like a threat, and every sound a potential harbinger of doom. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore. Michael's first stop was to the police station. He knew the odds were against him. Who would believe a homeless man's claim that a self-driving car was on a killing spree? But he had to try. Someone had to listen. The station buzzed with activity, officers hurrying in and out, their faces set in grim determination. Michael approached the front desk, suddenly feeling very self-conscious about his dirty clothes and unkempt appearance. "Excuse me," he croaked. The officer at the desk barely glanced up from his paperwork. "What do you want?" he snapped, his tone dripping with disdain. I need to report a crime. A self-driving Uber car. It hit a homeless man. On purpose. I saw it." The officer stared at Michael, giving his disheveled appearance a once-over. "You expect me to believe that some fancy car worth twice my salary decided to kill someone?" Michael hesitated, the absurdity of his claim not lost on him. But he pressed on. "It's true. I saw it with my own eyes, and I think it's going to happen again. There was something wrong with the car." The officer snorted, shaking his head. "Get out of here, you crazy bum. We've got enough real crimes to deal with. Scat!" Feeling the sting of rejection, Michael left the station with his head low. He kicked the door open and shuffled down the steps, thinking that if the police wouldn't listen, he'd be the one to have to stop the car. He started by retracing the car's erratic path, searching for any clues that might reveal its strange behavior. The streets were a labyrinth of sorrow, each turn unveiling a new layer of human suffering. The housing crisis and rising cost of living meant the homeless were everywhere in Phoenix. They huddled in doorways and alleyways, their eyes hollow and hopeless. As Michael made his way through tents, shopping carts, and bodies, they paid him no mind. He was like them, though not yet at their level of collective despair. One afternoon, as Michael sat on a grimy bench, poring over a makeshift map he drew of the car's movements, a woman approached him. She was gaunt, her face droopy with pain and loss. Her eyes seemed to hold 1,000 stories, each one sadder than the last. "You're looking for a car, aren't you?" she asked. Michael looked up, startled. How'd you know?" "I've seen it too," she replied, a haunted look in her eyes. "It killed my brother on the streets." As they shared their stories, Michael realized he wasn't surprised that the car had killed others. There was something wrong about this tech. It was supposed to make lives better, but was ending them. But at the same time, Michael was happy he was no longer alone in the search for answers, for a way to put an end to the bloodshed. Melissa had took Michael to meet some others who had seen the car do terrible things. Together, they formed an unlikely alliance, a band of outcasts united by tragedy and a desire for justice. They scoured the city, tracking the car's movements and piecing together a disturbing pattern. The car only seemed to be targeting the homeless, its deadly path weaving through the most impoverished areas of Phoenix. Michael and his newfound friends began to investigate the self-driving car's origins, determined to uncover the truth behind the car's agenda. At public library computers, they discovered that the company's technology was developed by a brilliant but reclusive software engineer, a man whose life had been shrouded in mystery and rumors of unethical experiments. The engineer was rumored to have been working on a secret project known only as the Cleaner, but no one knew exactly what this was. With his engineering background, Michael uncovered a series of hidden messages and cryptic codes embedded within the car's software. They pieced together a chilling picture. The Cleaner was a rogue algorithm designed to rid the city of its undesirable elements. It was a cold and calculating program that viewed the homeless not as people, but as problems to be solved. And it was using a self-driving Uber as its weapon of choice. The more they learned, the more they realized that their enemy was not just the car, but the very people who had created it. The company executives had turned a blind eye to the algorithm's deadly purpose, choosing profit over human life. They had gone to great lengths to cover up their crimes, leaving a trail of PR lies and deception in their wake. And though Michael and the others weren't sure, there's a nagging paranoia that comes with homelessness after all. They thought the self-driving Uber had somehow become aware of their investigation. They found themselves constantly looking over their shoulders, checking to see if the stealth four wheels of death was following them. They felt it close, somehow watching them, as if the car had developed a mind of its own, a demented intelligence that drove it to kill. And if that were true, then it would not stop until it had silenced anyone that dared expose its dark secret. Word got around about more homeless hit and runs, 1, 2, 3 more. Fearful that they would be the next victim, many homeless stayed huddled in their tents. Michael and his friends knew they had to act quickly. As Michael and the group examined the engineer's digital footprints, they found the coordinates of his lab had been encrypted. Michael spent days decrypting the code. Each attempt met with failure. But just as they were about to give up, a breakthrough led them to the location in the middle of the desert. The group thought if they went out there and paid him a visit, maybe they could convince the man to turn off his crazy car. After a long bus ride and a hike through the desert with the Phoenix sun beaming at full intensity, The group came across a corrugated metal building, a shiny industrial beacon amongst the cacti and rattlesnakes. Michael knocked on the door, but there was no answer. After a bit of back and forth, the group decided breaking in was the only option. Either that or we get run down by the car, one of them said. Inside, the building was dark, but they could see black metal stairs that led downstairs, where red and blue and green lights were flashing. As they descended into the depths of the hidden facility, the air grew colder, and a sense of unease had settled over them. It was as if they were entering the heart of the beast, the source of the city's hidden darkness. Downstairs was the lab, a maze of humming machinery and flickering monitors, each screen displaying a different facet of the car's programming. It was a rambling network of code and circuits, a reflection of the engineer's murderous mind. The group froze when they looked up. In the center of the room stood the engineer himself, his body dreary and skeletal, his eyes sunken and hollow. He looked more like a ghost than a man, a wraith who had been consumed by his own obsession. "You filthy people should not be here," he rasped. Michael stepped forward, his fist clenched at his side. "We've come to put an end to your madness. Your car has killed innocent people, and it's time for it to stop." The engineer laughed, a hollow, empty sound that echoed throughout the room. "You think you people can stop me? You think you can stop my car from getting rid of your kind? You're too late. The cleaner is already part of the system, ready to clean up your human pollution. It's everywhere. Every car has my device, ready to be activated. You can't stop it." "But we can try," Michael replied, his voice filled with steely determination. "And we won't stop until your car is destroyed and your crimes are exposed." The engineer sneered, a cruel smile twisting his gaunt features. "You think you can destroy my creation? Go ahead and try. You'll fail, just like everyone else who tried to stand in my way." With that, the engineer pressed a button, and the screens around him flickered to life. The group watched in horror as the city map popped up, showing dozens of small dots moving across its surface. The group knew what those dots were: cars, each one with the deadly algorithm embedded within its system, all of them moving towards the outskirts of the city, towards the homeless camps. "You're too late," the engineer repeated, his voice rising to a fevered pitch. "The cleaner is now already activated, and now it begins its final sweep." Michael felt his heart pounding in his chest as he realized the magnitude of their situation. They had to act fast before it was too late. He turned to his friends, eyes blazing with determination. "We have to find a way to stop those cars before they reach the camps. We have to shut down the algorithm and end this once and for all." The group sprang into action, frantically searching through the lab for anything that could help them. They found a computer terminal with a direct link to the car system, and Michael quickly set to work, typing furiously as he tried to override the algorithm's code. The minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity, as they worked to disable the deadly program. The rogue engineer watched them with a cold detachment, his eyes glinting with the satisfaction of a man who had believed he already won. "You can't do anything now. You've lost." But at last, Michael let a triumphant shout as he succeeded in disabling the code. The red dots on the screen flickered for a moment, but then they came back and continued on their path. As the rogue engineer let out a cackling laugh that came from his belly, one of the walls of the building rolled up. No, not a wall at all, a door, a garage bay door. The group were blinded by headlights. As their vision cleared, they could make out the form of the self-driving Uber, its front end pointed straight at them. Michael could see the maniacal grin of the engineer in the driver's seat, his eyes wide with mad glee. "Looks like you forgot about this one," he taunted before slamming down the accelerator. The car shot towards the group, its tires screeching on the concrete floor. The group scattered, diving to the sides as the car barreled past them. But Michael didn't move. Instead, he stood his ground, staring defiantly at the crazed engineer behind the wheel. The car came hurtling towards him, its grill just inches from his face. And then, at the last possible moment, Michael leapt forward, his hands outstretched. He grabbed onto the car's hood, pulling himself up onto the roof as it crashed into the computers and through the opposite metal wall, bouncing its way into the dusty desert. The wind whipped past Michael's face as he clung for dear life, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew he had to find a way to stop the car once and for all. In the distance, Michael could see the shine of the city skyscrapers. He thought of the other AI cars and the innocent people walking the streets who would soon be broken and bleeding. Michael knew he was the only one who could put an end to this madness that had claimed too many lives already. He closed his eyes, focusing his mind on the task at hand. He had to disable the car system. Michael slowly wormed his way across the roof of the car and swung his legs over to kick in the passenger window. The rogue engineer swerved wildly, trying to flick Michael off the car like a bug. And when the car bounced over some ruts, Michael almost went flying. But with extra effort, he slammed his foot again and again against the window. Finally, it broke. Michael pulled himself into the Uber, his heart racing with adrenaline. The rogue engineer looked over at him, his face twisted with rage. "What are you doing?" he shouted as he swatted at Michael. "Get out of my car!" But Michael ignored him in his weak punches. His eyes were locked on the car's console. He knew he had to get to the source of the algorithm, the root of the problem, the original cleaner. Michael lunged towards the rogue engineer, driving him into the driver's door with all his might. The back of the engineer's head bounced off the glass window and the car swerved. As the engineer was dazed, Michael followed up with a roundhouse punch that sounded like it broke bone. The engineer's eyes rolled in the back of his head as he went limp. Michael turned his attention to the control box that hung under the steering column. He yanked it open to find a small screen and keypad. His fingers flew over the keys, his mind working at a frantic pace as he tried to decipher the car's code. And then, at last, he found it, the gateway to the algorithm's core. With a deep breath, Michael hacked into the system. He knew he didn't have much time. His hands trembled as he entered the commands that would disable the car's deadly programming. As the car lights flickered and the engine whined, the engineer slowly came around and watched in horror as the car's system began to shut down one by one. At last, the car came to a stop. Michael climbed out, his chest heaving with exhaustion. He turned to face the engineer, who sat slumped over in the driver's seat, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. You can't do this," he gasped. "The cleaner, it's too big, too powerful, and it's already out there, out in the world. You can't stop it." But Michael just smiled and shook his head. "Well, I just did," he said. With another punch, the engineer went back to sleep. Michael started the car in normal mode, picking up his friends, and took the evidence to the police. After turning in the engineer and the car to the authorities, the group worked closely with law enforcement and tech experts. They tracked down and disabled the cleaner algorithm in all the affected self-driving Ubers. Michael and the group spread the word amongst the homeless community that the streets were safe once again. And as news of their efforts spread, the group became local heroes, fighting for justice on behalf of the city's homeless population. This new mission gave Michael a sense of purpose again. The corrupt executives that were responsible for installing the rogue algorithm were arrested. And after some time, new and supposedly improved self-driving cars were put back on the streets. And that's when the fear began spreading again.